Hello. Sam's still up. Hi, welcome to today's Wednesday lunch here at the Divinity School. I'm Taryn Lyme. I'm the Director of Communications here, and I organize this series. So it's my pleasure to welcome you here today to our last lunch of this winter quarter. So I want to do a little bit more than our usual housekeeping. I want to thank our student crew and our chef, Sam. Our other chef, Emily, is not here today. But if all of you crew want to just like stand up for 1 minute so we can thank you for all of your hard work. I think if you've been here before, you would agree that the food has been exceptionally delicious this quarter. And I want you to know that the students plan the meal, shop for the meal, cook the meal right here every week for you, and then if you come back next quarter, we'll have even more of this really delicious food. We do ask that you clean up after yourselves since they did all the cooking. So if you could, on your way out, we have that green bin there. That's a composter. So put in your leftovers and your paper plates and your napkins, and your silverware can go into the yellow soapy vat that we're going to put out. So that just helps us get out of here in a good amount of time. If you could turn off your cell phone ringers before we get started, we appreciate that. I also just want to let you know that, so I said this is the last lunch of the quarter. We're not going to pick up again until April. So if you are not getting our weekly emails, please see me afterwards and I can sign you up to make sure you hear about Wednesday lunches and all the conferences and other events that we have coming up here for everybody at the Divinity School. So I'm going to introduce today's speaker who drove in on the highway today from Grand Rapids, Michigan. Our speaker today, I'm thrilled to be able to introduce him, is Kelly James Clark. He is the director of the Kaufman Interfaith Institute at, wait, no, you tell me. No, I got it. Grand Valley State University's Kaufman Interfaith Institute, sorry. He's held visiting appointments at Oxford University, the University of St. Andrews, and the University of Notre Dame. He's the author, editor, co-author of over 20 books, including Abraham's Children, Liberty and Tolerance in an Age of Religious Conflict, Religion and the Sciences of Origins, and When Faith is Not Enough. He's here today to talk about his most recent co-authored book, Strangers, Neighbors, Friends, Muslim, Christian, Jewish Reflections on Compassion and Peace. And I'm just going to call him up and we'll hear from Dr. Clark now. Thank you so much.
If you don't mind, I'd like to start my talks off with a selfie. All the young kids will get it. And I'll talk. You got to get in here a little bit. Got it. As Karen said, thank you for the kind invitation. Should I get the microphone? I'm going to stand behind the podium, guys. So I'm going to rat out my alma mater. On Monday, I spoke at the University of Notre Dame on this topic, and I got my degree in philosophy at the University of Notre Dame. And 2 weeks before I came, I sent the announcement. I wrote to friends I knew. I wrote to former faculty members. I wrote to retired faculty members. I wrote to students who had been to the Middle East with me on different projects, and invited them all to come Monday at 5:30 to hear me talk on this topic. And 0 showed up, not one. And I'll tell you why, and then I'll relate this to what I want to say today. This doesn't count in contemporary philosophy. And I'm going to speak a little bit here to budding academics because I think it's sad. I realized when I turned 50 that most of what most philosophers do, and I'm guessing some of you know this already, most of what most philosophers do is totally irrelevant. And so it's not a secret for most of you. It was a secret for me. I thought when I was a graduate student, the project I was working on was the most important thing in the whole world. And everyone should be interested in it. It turns out not that many people were interested in it, or in much of philosophy, it turns out. I remember Notre Dame Journal for Formal Logic did a self-study when I was, I think I'd been out but a little bit later, but I remember reading the statistic. The average article in the Notre Dame Journal of Formal Logic is read by 1.47 people. And I published about 10 scholarly articles on liberty and tolerance in the 90s, and was semi-making a name for myself. People were asking me to write them. But then I figured out, like, why work so hard on these if only 1.47 people are going to read them? And then I figured one of those people was my mom. And that meant only 0.47 people were reading my articles. And then I'm going to tell you something that almost anyone who works in this area that I'm working in now says, then 9/11. Almost anyone that works in this says, then 9/11 happened. So I was writing about liberty and tolerance as an abstract topic, and I was doing something different from what other people were doing. I was arguing that it's okay for people to speak out of their faith perspectives in defense of liberty and tolerance. Almost every defense of liberty and tolerance, my guess is that any of you are aware of, almost any of them are Western, liberal, Enlightenment, and by that I mean anti-religious, white, male defenses of liberty and tolerance. And you can't bring anything of your own rich self to this topic in that discussion. And funny thing about the rest of the world, academics tend to project the image of themselves on the entire world. The entire world isn't like the University of Chicago. It's not like the University of Notre Dame. It's not like Harvard. Most of the rest of the world are religious believers. And most of them are not moved by white, Western, liberal, Enlightenment assumptions. And so I was defending liberty and tolerance and encouraging people to defend liberty and tolerance from their faith perspectives, to bring their whole person to bear on this. Then 9/11. And I decided to do something even more practical. So I got a grant from the Templeton Foundation to write Abraham's Children. Not write it, I edited it. I wrote some of it. I wrote my chapter. I wrote the introduction. And in it, I asked people to write from their faith perspectives in defense, Muslims, Christians, and Jews, in defense of liberty and tolerance. So I got Jimmy Carter to write for it. And Abraham and Wahid. And how many of you know who Abraham and Wahid is? I didn't either. Here's the funny thing. I was in favor of liberty and tolerance, then 9/11. I didn't know a single Muslim at the time. And here I'm trying to put together a book that has 5 Muslim contributors. And I really had to, the learning curve was steep for me. And it's been an awesome experience to add that to myself, really, is what I added it to. Abraham Wahid is the first democratically elected president of Indonesia. He was the leader of Nahdlatul Ulama, was the leader of Nahdlatul Ulama, the largest Muslim organization in the world. Indonesia is the most populous Muslim country in the world. All those things I didn't know before 9/11. He wrote the best essay in the book, Omnipotence Needs No Defense. And he hadn't had the title. And he's writing to fellow Muslims and saying, stop thinking that you need to defend omnipotence. God can take care of himself. And if you think that when you go out and make decisions about people's lives based on your understanding of God, then you're making a decision, a godlike decision. And that's blasphemy. 2 paragraphs. Just absolutely brilliant, right to the point. Absolutely stunning. So, Abraham's Children, published by Yale University Press. Yale University Press. I want you to be impressed, because none of you were impressed by reading the book or reading its reviews, or nobody was. It didn't sell that many copies, and maybe you noticed this too. Peace didn't break out in the world because of that book. We did a 10th anniversary of 9/11 celebration in D.C., but actually, and brought most of the authors together for the first time. We hadn't been together, and we came together. It was absolutely moving for us to be together. And the funny thing is, even though people, we think academics are sort of enlightened and the like, but I find when I take academics to Istanbul, it may be the first time they've ever been inside a mosque. I did a 3-year project on randomness and providence in the Abrahamic traditions, and I had Iranian Muslims and Israeli Jews meet together for the first time. And there's a lot of suspicion, a lot of things. Academics, are tribal just like anybody else. And we have to get academics out of their tribe. So bringing people, it wasn't mostly academics, by the way. We had many peace workers that were involved in writing that book, but we brought everybody together. And there's nothing like being together to build bridges and break down walls. And we persuaded a church in, I think it was Alexandria, I can't remember. It's the most diverse community in the United States, a suburb of Washington, D.C. And the church had never met anyone from the mosque, and there were 2 in town. And here's the other thing, the imams in the mosques had never met each other. And the church had never met the leaders of the synagogue. And what they decided to do is have us come and do a program. And the church served dinner, and we spoke at the dinner, and the church served people, and they agreed to keep meeting after that on things that they could agree on. And they started a poverty relief program together, Muslim, Christian, and Jew side by side. And all of this has continued to shape who I am and what I do as an academic. I publish scholarly articles and some scholarly books, but I'm not that interested in that anymore, even as a scholar. And I've learned things as a scholar that have gone into this book. So this book, let me just say, this book is written to 18 to 22-year-olds. The chapters are 3 to 5 pages long. They're written for the Twitter generation. They're mostly narratives, so they're almost all stories. I told my co-authors that they couldn't argue. They had to make a theological point, but they had to make it with a story. Everything I've learned in philosophy in the past 35 years went into this book, and not one philosopher wanted to come and hear about it. I'll just give you an example. Is Martha Nussbaum still in the school faculty? I've known her for a long time, and I remember reading her work. She wrote a book called Love's Narrative a long time ago, and I read that, and I began to think about narrative philosophy. Like, why are narratives more powerful than arguments, for example, for nearly everybody, and I think actually for everybody. And I taught a course called Narrative Philosophy. And then I started working in cognitive science of religion. And I mostly now, as an academic, work in cognitive science of religion. I published a book, I don't know, a while ago, called God in the Brain, 6 months ago, 8 months ago, God in the Brain on cognitive science of religion. I used to work in epistemology, where we would look at what is knowledge, justified true belief, reliable true belief. We'd look at these definitions, we'd come up with abstract counterexamples. And then I just slowly got interested in how our minds really work. Not how philosophers think they should work, but how they do work. I do experiments with psychologists. I've done them in China, for example, in Singapore, in underexplored countries. I've trained Chinese scholars in cognitive science of religion on the empirical side. And so here's one thing I learned in cognitive science, and anyone can look it up, and again, a lot of you will know this intuitively, but it's been proved. Most people, if there are 2 people that are having a discussion about things that are important to them, so one holds A and one holds not A, and one person starts arguing, the person that holds A will become more extreme in their views and more certain, more dogmatic. Arguments push people apart and make people more dogmatic. Now this really hurt me. I'm a philosopher, I love arguments. my wife's been telling me for years arguments aren't so great. You know, don't people aren't moved by arguments. But you know, no one likes to have their fallacies pointed out to them, stuff like that. And so my wife's been on this for years, and it's been telling me this. And then all of a sudden I read this study, and I come home. You know, Susan, have you seen this study? She says, "Oh, honey, this is exactly what I've been telling you for years." So cognitive science has been driving me into trying to figure out how to communicate to people who don't want to be communicated with sometimes. That they shouldn't be so extreme and so dogmatic. And even if they are extreme and dogmatic, here's the point of this book. I asked each of my co-authors, a Muslim and a Jew, I asked each of them to speak from their own traditions to people in their own traditions, to speak their language, and then to do it with stories and try to move them along. And then I asked them to do one other thing. Act like other people from other traditions, or maybe no tradition. I'll just give you an example. A friend of mine from high school, quote, if Islam is a religion of peace, why is there so much war in Muslim worlds? Well, how do you communicate to him about Islam? One thing I do, he newly friended me on Facebook, so and I'm going to say something to him, and he won't be happy, but I travel all over the world, and mostly in the Middle East now, and when I go, I always ask to give a talk on this book, wherever I go. My best audience are Muslims. I hate to say this, my best friends are Muslims. You know, it sounds cliche. I spoke at Al-Azhar University in Cairo, Egypt. Al-Azhar's, for 1,000 years, the most influential Muslim university in the world. I was told I would never get in to Al-Azhar University, that they wouldn't let a Christian in to speak there. And I just persisted and persisted, and there are so many people of goodwill at Al-Azhar University. There are also some kooks there. And it's hard to get in, and they're really careful about who gets in. And I gave a talk to over 200, mostly undergraduate students, on Muslim and Christian reflections on compassion and peace. So when I go, I take selfies wherever I go, because I'm trying to normalize people's views of Muslims on Facebook. I'm trying to use media to communicate, because I know media is way more powerful than argument. And so you'll be on there, and you'll normalize people's views of something. This looks like a melting pot, so it probably won't help that much. But anyway, wherever I go, I take selfies and put it on. I have a webpage, Abraham's Children. I have 20,000 followers on Abraham's Children, and photos go on there too. And I mostly put good news about religion on that page. I put bad news if it's Islamophobia or anti-Semitism, which have been on the rise. So I put that it's there, we need to fight it. But I mostly put good news about religion, because I'm trying to overcome the negative, the huge impression that negative views, especially of Islam, have on people in America. If we already have fears, bad news feeds those fears easily, and it's very hard to overcome fear. I asked each of my co-authors to write from their own traditions. Aziz Abu Sar is my Muslim co-author, and you may not know his name immediately, but some of you may know that about a year and a half ago, a Palestinian ran for mayor of Jerusalem. And he was on the cover of Newsweek, on the cover of Time. New York Times wrote about it. The BBC had stories on him. He couldn't technically run for mayor because he isn't really a citizen. He was born there, he was raised there, his family has been there for years and years, but he isn't really fully a citizen, and so couldn't run for mayor. And really what he was trying to do was call attention to the legal plight of some Palestinians, and he also was trying to get Palestinians to vote. He wanted it to go to the Supreme Court. He wanted Palestinians to be more politically engaged. And he wants Palestinians not to be engaged in violence, like he once was. Aziz, when he was 9, Aziz lived in East Jerusalem, And on a Ramadan, at 4 in the morning, he tells the story in here in the first chapter. His brother had thrown some rocks at some jeeps of the Israeli Defense Force, and they broke into his house and rousted the whole family at 4 a.m. And Ramadan took his brother away and put him in prison. 9 months later, they let his brother out. He'd been tortured for 9 months, and they took him to a hospital for surgery immediately, and his brother died. Tortured to death for throwing rocks at jeeps. Imagine the influence of that on a 9-year-old. Aziz writes this at the end of that story. He says, by the time I was 13, I had become politically active. I constantly read the news and participated in protests that sometimes turned violent. When I was 16, I became a leader in the youth movement for Fatah, one of the largest Palestinian political parties. I became an editor for Fatah Youth magazine in Jerusalem, writing pamphlets and mobilizing new members. He says, the dismal life of a Palestinian boy, displaced, disenfranchised, and distressed, is fertile ground for the radicalization of justifiably angry young men. That's chapter 1, and it doesn't stay there. Aziz now is famous for running a tourist agency. He has a Jewish partner. If you look in last August Smithsonian Magazine, their joint Muslim-Jewish agency is on the cover of Smithsonian Magazine. It's a long article on him. You can see 3 or 4 photos of Aziz. You can see his Jewish partner. He now is a peace worker. He's won 3 peace prizes. He's probably in his mid-30s. And most of the book is the story of his move from radical to peace worker. Let me just tell you, it's a funny story, what really started to do it. Aziz grew up in a pretty segregated Israel. He only took Palestinian taxis. He only ate at Palestinian restaurants. He only bought things at Palestinian markets. He watched Palestinian television shows or Arab language television shows. He could only speak Arabic by the time he graduated from high school. And he says, my only interactions with Israelis were at checkpoints. And those weren't always happy. But he decided that if he was going to get anywhere in Israeli society, he had to learn Hebrew. So he signed up to take a class at a Hebrew school. Most of the people were Americans or Canadians who were coming to Israel to learn Jewish Americans who were coming to Israel to learn Hebrew. And he's in that class, the only Arab. He says, now that I was forced to learn Hebrew, I was determined simply to learn the language, not make friends. I walked into the class and quickly saw that I was the only Palestinian. There were a few non-Jews, Christians, but no other Palestinians or Muslims. But the majority were Jewish. I sat down quickly, closed myself within, and was determined not to talk. I was in the enemy's lair, and I was scared to death. My heart pounded faster and faster. I felt that everyone was looking at me, judging me, hating me. Surely they were thinking, why is this Arab here? They probably also saw me as an enemy. Maybe they were afraid. I was scared, uncomfortable, and frustrated. I wanted to run out the door. In this foreign situation, surrounded by the enemy, I didn't know how to act. And then he says this, when the teacher approached me and said, hi, how are you, in Arabic, I was confused. And then even more so when she smiled and warmly welcomed me to the class. This was the very first time I'd been recognized as a human being as an Israeli. And then he goes on, the class forced him to be in small groups with people in the class. And he started asking, what do you eat? What do you like? And he says, I remember that some of my fellow students like country music, like me, and we shared a special appreciation for Johnny Cash. Most of my Palestinian friends could care less about Johnny Cash. They were into pop music. I soon felt comfortable making jokes and fooling around with the same people I wouldn't even have considered saying hi to a week ago. I argued about the Israeli love of instant coffee versus the Palestinian love of Arabic cardamom-flavored brewed coffee. I was right, of course, and they were wrong. From country music to coffee, we had become friends. And I'm just going to read one more piece here because I asked each person to quote something from their authoritative scripture and relate it to their story. So this is what he quoted. Grievous to him is what you suffer. Quran 9:128. Grievous to him, to Allah, is what you suffer. Aziz grew up being taught that there was no Holocaust, that the Jews didn't really need to have their own homeland. And the students in the class persuaded him and then took him to go to the Holocaust Museum. So the first thing that happened, the kind teacher and then the kind students, and then the Holocaust Museum. And for the first time, he saw the suffering of Jews. He says this at the end of this chapter: from Hebrew school to the Holocaust Museum, I learned to choose compassion. Grievous to me is what you suffer. Choosing love crowded out all thoughts of revenge, and I began to act with kindness and mercy. And there's more chapters. So, by the way, I've got a couple of extra copies, so you're going to get one. The cook, he saved me a plate of food. If it's gone, he's not getting one. Let me have to see how we're doing for time. I know it's...
We're 10 to 1.
10 to 1? Okay. So let me tell you a little bit about what I write in mine. I asked each of the co-authors to write what they learned from other traditions, because I think it's good to model that you can learn things from other traditions. So each of us had to write a chapter, what I learned from the two other traditions. So I think when I talk about mine, I'll just tell you what I learned. And this involves my alma mater, Notre Dame, again. I was raised very conservative, West Michigan Christian, and Protestant Christian. And so we thought people are saved by grace alone. Nothing in my hands I bring, simply to the cross I cling. So I was taught Catholics weren't really Christians. That they had works righteousness. They were trying to earn their way to heaven. So Catholics were bad, and that's what I thought all the way through college. I was 22, and then 23 even, 24 even. I worked for a church for a year. I went to a school in the South for a year where almost all the students were Protestants and thought Catholics were probably followers of the Antichrist. And then I went to Notre Dame. And so I know where this is going. I like Aziz. I had coffee. I talked about music. Actually, just a little thing about the priests. It isn't always coffee. You go into their office, they open the doors with their drawers, up comes the whiskey, and you have a little talk, and you find out that these are human beings, not spawns of Satan or something. And I after about a year or two, I just couldn't believe anymore that these people weren't Christians. I remember one time I was a Young Life leader working with high school students, and we took kids on a retreat. And one of the philosophy professors, who's Catholic, his son went on the retreat, and I'm in an elevator. It's full of people, and I'm in an elevator with this professor the day after this retreat, and he tells me, "Hey, Kelly, I don't know what you did last weekend, but my son Joey came home and said," remember, Catholic professor, says, Joey said to him, "Hey, Dad, I've been a Catholic all my life. Last weekend I became a Christian." And I'm like cowering. And we weren't anti-Catholic in this organization. So anyway, after a year or two at Notre Dame, I thought I just couldn't, because of my contact with Catholics, think that they were all going to hell. But them Muslims, that's what I thought. They became my new. I think we always need, and not in the good sense of need, we always need people who are out, people that we can look down on, people that we can feel better than. You ever go to a mall? Or downtown Chicago, you don't have to go to a mall. Go to downtown Chicago and just sit and watch people go by and look at some young person go by and say, a tattoo on her face. Oh, I'd never do that to my face. and then the hair's shaved on this one side or something. I'd never do that to my hair. And mom comes down with a kid's got snot coming down her mouth, and you think, I wouldn't let my kid, do that. And every person that goes by just like that, you've got them judged. Anybody ever do that? Me neither. So, anyway, I think we need people to look down on, and I don't commend this about human beings. I just think it's part of the human condition, and our spirituality is not unaffected by that sort of pride and tribalism. And so, for me, the next bad people, so I could feel good about myself. It's not that I wanted to put everybody down; it's that I wanted to feel good about myself. And here's the way I can feel good about myself spiritually. I'm way better than them Muslims. So on my first trip to a Muslim majority country in Turkey, I was invited into a home by a Muslim family, and they cooked dinner for my group. There were about 10 of us in our group, and the man of the house got up and left. We didn't know why exactly. Then all of a sudden we heard, through the windows in the summer, the window was open, we heard the call to prayer. And the people in the family says, oh, he's an imam. He's doing the call to prayer tonight. That's him. And then while he was doing this, another one of the Turks got up and left and came back in a little bit. And when he came back, another one got up and came back, and pretty soon, like, all the Turks had got up and left. And I'm thinking, did they all drink a lot of tea before dinner? Because none of us were getting up. The food was good. We weren't getting up. And I just said, and I just couldn't fathom it. I said, so what are you doing? And they said, well, we've all gone off to pray. No one announced it. No one called any attention to it. They didn't call any attention to themselves. The imam didn't call any attention to himself. And it just sort of melted my view that Muslims are doing this to be proud, or to be seen, or to have God see what they do. And then I asked them, what do they do? And so they told me, and I have it in here, I read it, and it's good to read, but roughly what they're doing, they start off with the very first chapter of the very first words in the Quran. Roughly, there is no God but Allah. And God is merciful. And then they bow down. And I couldn't even bow down in a Catholic worship service because I thought that was works. And then these people are doing this and saying this. And I saw these people, and I began to think this about what they were doing. That bowing down 5 times a day, every day, saying, there's just one God, there's just one God. Part of what you're saying is, I'm not God. And to me, that going out and looking and putting people down is me trying to be God, trying to elevate myself. And this is something that you can do 5 times a day, every day, to come down, to bring yourself down, to realize who you are. I began to think even atheists could profit from saying 5 times a day, I'm not God, I'm not God, I'm not God. That's a good thing. And then I began to think that's not, the ritual isn't just to get your body in position, it's really to get your soul, yourself in a position. The ritual is supposed to do something to human beings. It's supposed to make us more humble. It's supposed to make us more compassionate and wise. And so I began to think it was a good thing. And then I worked through all the many of the other Islamic rituals, and I actually began to understand Catholic rituals. But only after this prayer, that prayer really got me to think differently about people who are really different from me. I think I'm going to close here. I just want to say this. People often ask when we give the talk, we've done a book tour, the 3 of us have been involved, and they always want to know about Israel, Palestine. I don't want to talk about Israel-Palestine. And we try to put people off from talking about it. There's no politics in this book. And the reason I don't want to talk about Israel-Palestine is because it makes it look like it's their problem. The Jews and the Muslims, like it's their problem. And the bigotries that we talk about in the book are in all of us. Let me just tell you one example, because Hashem's here and he's from Iran. I went to Iran a few years ago, and I professionally work on anti-Muslim bigotry. I'm a leader in anti-Muslim bigotry. And I'm flying into Iran, and the pilot says, you are now entering Iranian airspace. And all the men on the plane go, Allahu Akbar. And I thought I was going to die. My heart started pounding. I thought the bomb was going to go off. We were going down. Just like that, I realized I got a lot of bigotry in me still I got to get rid of. And, I need to walk down the street and meet my Muslim neighbor. I don't need to start talking about, and then looking down on Israel and Palestine, or Israelis and Palestinians, or Jews and Muslims. I don't need to do that. I got enough to work on in my own neighborhood. And so I encourage people, often when I do this, I'll have people get up and talk and meet people who are in the audience and exchange phone numbers and try to get together later. But we need to get out of our silos, and we need to meet people who are different from us. I think our only hope in learning compassion and peace is for us to be in a position where a kind Israeli teacher can say something to you in Arabic, or you can share your coffee with somebody, or your love of country music, and you find out they're human beings. We spend a lot of time dehumanizing people who are different from us, and I think our only hope for getting along is for us to rehumanize each other, and the only way to do that is to reach out our hand in compassion and peace. All right, thank you. I'm going to take, we have 10 or 15 minutes for questions.
Thank you very much. You didn't talk much about your own faith and how you find yourself and that your faith is leading you into this work. Is that true for you?
Yeah, I wrote a book on the Gospels called Written to Be Heard. And I wrote it with someone who got his PhD from the University of Chicago. He's almost 80, but he did it at a time. He was a famous biblical narrative guy here when he was a student, so it must have been the 50s maybe, or 60s. So he does biblical narrative, and I do philosophy, but it was a really fascinating exercise for me to look at. We looked at each of the Gospels as if people would have heard them, and this is what I heard over and over from Jesus in each of the Gospels, at least Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Being a follower of Jesus shouldn't make you feel superior to anybody else. It should make you humble. Even though it's the truth, even though it's the way, as a follower of Jesus, it shouldn't elevate you in any way above other people. In fact, what you should do is bow down at people's feet and wash their feet, for example, or love them the way you may love a child. That you have to include the kingdom of God is supposed to be here on earth. The Christians are supposed to be bringing in the kingdom of God now, and it's a radically inclusive kingdom. It includes the poor and the oppressed and the outcast. And this was the interesting thing for me in the work I was doing, and enemies. You have to love enemies. And I look at contemporary, I don't want to be totally very political here, but people that support Trump don't seem to get that exactly. Like there's a lot of fear of enemies. And I just think that's a misunderstanding of the way of Jesus. If you're going to follow Jesus, and you might think, well, we're in a particularly dangerous time, so we really have to fear. We're actually in the safest time in the history of the world, and Not if you live in Iraq, where the United States drops lots of bombs, or Syria, where we drop lots of bombs. No one kills more innocent people than we do, but we are safe here in the United States, and we're not expanding the kingdom. So anyway, my own journey has taken me, I like Jesus better, I like Christianity a lot less from doing this. And it sort of forced me to look. And I used to just think Christianity was mainly about how to get into heaven. That's what I thought growing up. And I was going to get into, Catholics weren't. And then Catholics and I were, and Muslims weren't. You know, that's so I expanded heaven, but I wasn't thinking of Christianity in terms of expanding God's kingdom of justice and compassion and peace here on earth. And doing all this work has forced me to rethink that. Good question, Pete. That isn't really your name, is it? Yeah. Other questions? Yeah.
I'm curious what you think. So, like, you talked a lot about I know you say you don't want to get into Israel-Palestine too deeply, but you did speak quite a bit about it. And I agree that, like, Israelis and Palestinians don't know each other as much as they should. It would be good if they could get to know each other better and have less hatred. But how do you do that without losing sight of the fact that this is a situation where you use the word segregation, where you use the word oppression, where, like, the Israeli state is oppressing the Palestinian people, and that's something that should change.
So you're asking me to talk about what I for sure don't. I'll just tell you, I had 36 people for 3 years, 12 Muslims, 12 Christians, and 12 Jews, all academics. One of the women is a displaced Palestinian, so lives in Jordan, a famous biologist that lives in Jordan. And almost all the Jews are either from or live in Israel. And she just, I understand her anger. Like, I wouldn't want her, so her family had to leave. I get it. But what she didn't understand was that a lot of the Jews in our group work for peace. So she thinks all Jews in Israel are followers of Benjamin Netanyahu, and was painting Jews with this brush. And then I got so I said, well, to this woman, why don't you just go talk to Sam? And just talk to him and just see if you still think this after talking to Sam. And that was a good thing. But then we were thinking of going to Morocco. We went to Morocco. And it's hard to find a place where you can meet with Muslims, Christians, and Jews. It's way more difficult than you can imagine. Like, one difficulty is kosher food. There are countries where you just can't get it. So if you have kosher Jews, you can't go to those countries. It's really difficult. Other places make it difficult for Jews to come. If we did it in Israel, which I would love to do, to have people. I'll just say one thing about this. Israelis and Arabs live together in peace in lots of places in Israel, like Haifa, for example, this one place where they do. We know Arabs and Israelis can get along because they do. It's possible because it's actual in some places. At any rate, I said we're going to go to Morocco. The king of Morocco overstated, but said that Morocco is very Jew-friendly. Come on, Jews, you're welcome here. Even though Morocco, I think, pretty much kicked Jews out in, I think it was the 50s or so, like his great-grandfather or something. But I said, we're going to go, there's a synagogue there, and we're going to go. The year before, we had only gone to, we were in Macedonia, so we had only gone to some ancient churches and some mosques. And I said, this year, we're going to go to some Jewish sites, too. There's an ancient synagogue in Marrakesh. And one of my Muslims wrote and said, I'll go into churches, I'll go into mosques, but I won't go into any Jewish sites. And another wrote something nasty. So even after 2 years of being together, there was a lot of nastiness. So even though we were an academic group, I said, well, let's just address this as a group. And I asked for one representative from each of the traditions talk about Israel-Palestine. And two of the two that had raised these issues said, not only will I not be the representative to speak, I won't even go if you have a meeting where we talk about it. And they didn't. And the one that said she wouldn't go in a synagogue didn't go in the synagogue. And you can imagine, here we have our own little Israel-Palestine right in our academic group, and where we've been working for 3 years to try to get people to address these things. But we did do it as a group, and the 36 other people that came, each of us gave a talk. And I'll just tell you basically what I said. The U.S. has no moral ground. No one in the U.S. has the moral ground to criticize Israel. Because that's the main thing academics like to do, is they're pro-Palestinian, anti-Israel. I said, we don't have this moral ground here in the U.S. because nobody kills more innocent people around the world than us. Israel is a rank amateur compared to the people that we kill. And so I just didn't say, I didn't take a side. And I said, I'm not going to take a side. I don't think we should take sides here. And although we should encourage people to work for peace. And the Muslim that did speak was just awesome. And he was from Iran. And he had never met an Israeli before this. 3 years ago, he met his first Israeli. And it transformed him. He was fantastic. And Sam, our Jewish representative, was fantastic. Anyway, I don't know what...
So do you think there's room for I guess, anyone, but I guess particularly Muslims, to engage in the kind of dialogue that you're talking about with the, Jewish people and the Jewish tradition and religion while maintaining their animosity towards the Israeli state?
Well, so you don't need to do dialogue for people who are at peace. And dialogue is really important for people that really deeply don't get along. And so I think it's important to do. I tried to get those two people in our group. I got one woman who was had deep animosity towards Israel to talk, and it was really valuable. I couldn't get two of them to do it. But I think it's super important. And I'm pointing to him because he's from around. He's the only person I knew here from here before we're Facebook friends. He's a philosopher here at the University of Chicago, and I have a group with Muslims, Christians, and Jews to discuss philosophy together. And yeah, I think it's totally important. It's got to be done. It's super hard to do. I don't know how to do it. I didn't figure it out. I mean, it worked in one case. It didn't work in these other two cases. But yeah, it's got to be done. This is just what has to be done. And we need creative ways to figure out how to do it. That's the deal of the century didn't involve Palestinians in its development. And I can tell you, people are going to feel condescended to if somebody from on high gives them the deal of the century, even if it's God himself. They aren't going to be too happy with the Ten Commandments from on high. If people weren't involved in the dialogue, it just isn't going to work. I think it's a bad deal of the century, but not involving them in the dialogue was a bad thing. Good question. You still get your book.
We're actually out of time.
Okay.
You want to talk about the book from there?
Yeah.
Or something with the book? Otherwise.
Yeah, I've got copies of the book. So if you really, I didn't bring one for everybody, but if you really want one, if you find it that's going to be, if you could use it in a class, if you cook me food, there are books here. The Fetzer Foundation in Kalamazoo likes the book and the message, and so they are funding this trip. The University of Chicago isn't contributing anything to this except to open their hearts to us today. We've been all over the country with the book. Anyway, I've got maybe a dozen copies, which I'd be happy to give away. Thank you all.